I wanted to thank you all for coming to this event. Actually, this series of 3 events where we are trying to sort of give an overview of the scope of the project and the contents of a second charter. And we have a very distinguished panel today. I will introduce the speakers briefly as we go around the questions that I have set out. I think that most of the people in the room would agree with the statement that the global governance architecture that we have in place today, that came out of the San Francisco Conference in 1945 with the adoption of the UN Charter, is out of date. I think that's not controversial, right? And of course, the evidence of this is everywhere around us. I don't want to dwell on this too much. These issues are ones that we are all familiar with. The breaching of planetary limits and the process of climate change, which is ongoing, is a great source of concern. Experts speak more and more of the unraveling of the nuclear order. We have the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has an article, Article 6, which calls for nuclear disarmament. And in fact, countries are going in exactly the opposite direction. We're spending vast sums of money every year, including during COVID, when one could have argued that we had great needs for financing, modernizing the nuclear arsenals and adding to them. There are vulnerabilities in our global financial architecture. Again, this is a vast subject. There will be many meetings over the next few days on this very subject. But take it from me, I'm an economist, and could there be another global financial crisis of a scale similar to that of 2008, 2009? Yes, absolutely. Maybe not due to the same reasons as the previous crisis, but due to other factors. And of course, we continue to have an ongoing problem on the poverty and the inequality side. So I'm not surprised, therefore, that Secretary Gutierrez last year, when we began his speech at the General Assembly, he said, global governance is stuck in time. We cannot effectively address problems as they are if institutions don't reflect the world as it is. Josh Lincoln, in his remarks in the first panel, already laid out a very nice evolution of UN 75 in 2020, our common agenda, where the questions of what kind of a future do we want and how do we get there were put on the table, I think, very aptly by the Secretary General. And then, of course, we are on the eve of the Summit of the Future in coming days, right? So all of this is very good. I think I am very encouraging by this heightened sense of danger that we are facing as a human family. And I guess my question, and a question that will resonate throughout these panels, is whether the actions that will be precipitated by this recognition that we're at a very critical moment in our history will be enough or will be sufficient or taken in time to prevent further deterioration of the context around us. Ambassador Kimani, I want to begin this conversation with you. And for those of you who are online, the program for today is basically a series of questions to the panelists. I will come back to them twice, and so I will be very grateful for sort of synthesize responses so that we don't run into other people's time. Ambassador Kimani, you recently gave a talk or maybe wrote something, which I picked up, where you say that systems that do not adjust to the environmental conditions around them eventually become unstable. And I thought when I read this that it was a very apt statement of an insight from systems theory. My question to you to get this conversation started is, what is the catalyst that will precipitate such changes, right? I think that you said for the United Nations, the choice is either to evolve or to die. So what will be those triggers that will hopefully push us in the direction of evolution rather than death and collapse, right? Is it going to be inspired leadership? I don't mean that sarcastically. The creation of the European Union, I think in some respects, reflect inspired leadership after the end of World War II. Or is it going to be growing instability, which then leads to dislocations on a global scale, which then perhaps precipitates the kind of mind shift that is necessary to bring into being the kinds of reforms that are embedded in the second charter? Please.
Thank you very much, Augusto, for this extremely difficult question. And good morning to you all. Obviously, I don't have the time to be as comprehensive as I'd like to be. And I do find the matter of how the United Nations will evolve, the charter and the institutions, to be a very vexing and difficult one for me. But to answer your question, there is no such thing as stability in nature. Perhaps only death is a form of stability. Everything else is shifting and changing constantly. The search for stability is one of the most frustrating and unreachable goals for human beings. And so we either progress or we regress. We either continue to fail or we start to succeed. And the United Nations was born from a humanity that had been broken at the anvil. Its spirit had seen such darkness, such catastrophe, that for once, even those in great positions of power were moved to forms of humility. And so the United Nations is both a political deal amongst the powerful and an aspiration for a better world. And it mixes these two dimensions. Many of us hold on desperately to the hopefulness and the aspiration while trying to deal with, and sometimes even try and ignore, the political deal that brought this about. When COVID came along and paralyzed all of us and froze us all in our own homes, I thought it was a crisis of such magnitude that it would finally drive home the point of interdependence. Interdependence not as an idealism, but interdependence as hard-headed realism. But it didn't. It didn't. And so one must then ask, what is the magnitude of crisis between World War II and COVID that needs to then come about? And I don't want to discover what that crisis is. So the question then is left to, what do we do to enable this system to evolve in line with what it needs to be today? And for that, Augusto, without making it a lecture and becoming a pedant, I believe that international cooperation has always led the way, and the UN has followed. I don't think the United Nations is a leader. I think it's a follower. The decolonization was not driven from the Trusteeship Council. Decolonization was driven by an international cooperation of emancipation. The conferences of Bandung, the attempts to craft a new third column of countries away from what was then called the First World and the Second World. The so-called Third World, which later became a pejorative term, but used to be a term of pride, was a term that had anti-colonization and the realization of self-determination at its very heart. And that is what enabled all the massive changes in terms of the UN's role in decolonization, even the entry of China into the P5, and even the expansion of the elected members. So that is to say, we need to infuse energy into different forms of international cooperation that insist on reform of the UN much more than we focus exactly in discussing these issues with the UN. We need to bring to the UN a fait accompli, as opposed to seek a fait accompli at the UN. What I mean by that is if the Africans want a permanent seat and veto power, the Eswini consensus wants two as a minimum. They won't get it at the UN. They have to get it at the African Union. They have to get it at the African Union by the African Union aligning itself with such purpose as reflected in the reforms to its own peace and security architecture, that it makes the change in the Security Council here in New York an inevitable need for Africa to resolve its peace and security crisis. If the Africans are not united enough, determined enough, intentional enough, then they're just going to have to settle for some charity seats. And those charity seats will come with great privilege and responsibility, but almost with no change in how the Security Council works. So that is to say the onus is not on the leaders who are coming here next week. The onus is on the forces that really do seek to change the international order. I've been part of the state-led system, and I fundamentally do not believe that they are the ones who are going to deliver Security Council reform. They will if driven from the outside. So the way to evolve the system, Augusto, is for all of us to take ownership of it. And to not always, sorry, it's a little aside. I've been seeing a lot of write-ups leading to the Summit of the Future saying, and I even did one with Winnie Byanyima, saying leaders coming to New York should, and we all assume we know who these leaders are. They're heads of state and government. But in fact, those are just 193 or so people. We need a much more determined outreach to networks of leadership that understand that if the UN does not evolve, it's not just the 193 leaders who are going to have a hard time. The rest of us are going to suffer a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kimani. We'll come back in the second round to dig a little bit deeper into this question of Security Council reform. But let me ask Ambassador Narvaez, who is the representative of Chile at the UN. You know, the second charter project was given impetus by the questions posed by the Secretary General a couple of years ago about, you know, what kind of future do we want and how do we get there? And the people who were convened by the Global Governance Forum, the experts to work on this project, you know, felt very, very strongly that we needed to begin that conversation about the kinds of reforms to the global governance architecture that were needed to empower the UN system, not only to be a kind of a problem-solving organization, but also to be a more effective instrument, you know, to address, you know, many of the challenges that we face today. So we are here on the eve of the Summit of the Future, and what I wanted to ask you is, what are your hopes for the Summit of the Future? You know, if we had this conversation next week or late next week, what, in your view, would constitute a successful Summit of the Future? And are the heads of state who are going to put their names on the Pact of the Future, you know, aware, in your view, of the responsibilities of this particular moment?
Thank you very much, Augusto, and thank you for convening this meeting. Good morning, everyone, my fellow panels. It's a pleasure to be with you and also with sharing with the people that is online connected and hearing from there. I have some notes here, but when I hear Martin and I hear your question, I think that one of the most important outcomes after the Summit of the Future is honesty. because we use important words, and I think that words needs to meaning for people in a very clear way what we are trying to say. Yesterday or 2 days ago, we as a country faced the General Assembly addressing the situation in Gaza. And we said there that it's quite hard to speak about the future with the situation in Gaza today. So we need to be frank and we need to be honest to build trust from the people perspective. The UN needs to reconnect with people's necessity, with people's reality. And for that, we need a more open UN and we need a more inclusive UN. I was president of the ECOSOC for 1 year. It was an honor, absolutely, and a great experience. I learned a lot about the importance of development pillar. Of course, I already knew that because, you know, my previous experience as a former UN staff as well. But living there, knowing different realities all around the world, I realized the importance of civil society engagement. I think that's the only way for our decisions to be sustainable. If we are able to open our decisions with the people. Because the charter says, we the people, not we the states. Oh, I completely understand the idea of state representing the people, of course. But for that, we need states that are open to have the channels with the people to put in place public policies that represent the decisions that we take here in the United Nations. And I come from a country where we have been able to do so. Of course, we have many problems. I don't want to say that we have everything solved. But I can say here that, for instance, in Chile, a UN recommendation is fundamental when we propose a specific public policy in different areas. If we build the 2030 agenda from bottom to up with the people, and we implement a national strategy for the 2030 agenda with the people, from the local space to the national space, we are doing our job in the sense and directions that we are trying to put in the principles of the 2030 agenda, for instance. But we need to have those channels and we need to have the political will to do so. So that's why I think that honesty is so important and not rhetoric and speeches that are beautiful, but we need that those speeches can transform in action. And I want to say that regarding the Summit of the Future specifically, we engage in all the process in a very constructive way because we are very constructive as a country, because I'm here speaking as a permanent representative of my country. And we think that we are, now, maybe also in the past, but now more than ever, in the necessity to address the how, as the Secretary General told us this week. So the 2030 agenda was the what, the Summit of the Future addresses the how to do the things that we need to do. And we are in that path. We believe in that idea, in that approach, that the implementation is part of this new area for the United Nations, for this new cycle. People needs to be that the multilateral system is delivering for them. I think I can stop here and maybe we can.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Ambassador Narvaez. We now shift gears a little bit, and we're trying to get into some of the core proposals in the second charter. And I will begin with Andrew Strauss. Andrew Strauss is professor of law at the School of Law at the University of Dayton and a former dean of the law school. Andrew, the second charter proposes to turn the United Nations from an organization of states into an organization of states and peoples. And it does this through the proposal of creating a parliamentary assembly, sort of a bicameral structure. Tell us a little bit about the core of these proposals, and in particular, how would these two organizations interact with each other? I know this is a very complex subject, so try to do that in 5 minutes.
Sure, I'm up for the challenge anyway. Sure, I'm up for the challenge. First, I just like to frame this, I think, given the discussion that we've been having in terms of political reality, because that seems like Ambassador Kamani's point about needing grassroots support to really make any changes, and our Ambassador Narvaez's point as well about connecting directly to the people. That what we've tried to do with the Parliament, and really throughout the second charter, is to reflect the political realities of the day. Obviously, it's a very sort of far-sighted document that's well beyond what's coming out of the Summit of the Future. But I think our aim has really been to aim for that sort of sweet spot where it's ambitious, but not impossible. And that it provides a context for really mobilizing people around the world behind a vision. I think this is what's so important today. A lot of what the politics that's happening is very destructive. It's very regressive. If we actually have something that's far-sighted enough that people can get excited about it, but also realistic enough that you can say this can actually happen, then I think we've hit that sweet spot. And that's really the goal, I think, throughout our document, and particularly with this new parliamentary assembly. And I'll sort of conclude by talking about the big picture of the assembly. But first, let me try and address Augusto's specific questions about how the Parliament will work and how it will work with the General Assembly. The General Assembly may remain sort of the upper house, if you will, of the institutional schema that we came up with. It continues to be the chief deliberative and policy-making body, as we call it, of the United Nations. The Parliament will be elected based on the principle of digressive proportionality, meaning that all countries should have some representation, a minimum of 2 delegates per country, and the larger countries will be limited to 10% of the delegates, so that there's some acknowledgement to the size and power of countries, but also an ability for all countries to have representation. Elections, we encourage popular elections like takes place in the European Parliament today. However, there's a recognition again in a concession to reality that that's not going to be possible in all countries. And so again, as the European Parliament began, the initial approach that we accept for many countries will be to have their own parliaments elect representation. And we strongly encourage, stop short of a requirement, but strongly encourage that opposition parties, where possible, are also represented in the Parliament. Delegates are independent. This is absolutely crucial of their national delegations. They're supposed to operate as representatives of their constituents and more broadly representatives of the global community, and are not supposed to take directions from their governments, and their ability to continually be credentialed is tied to maintaining this independence. The Parliament's powers would be largely advisory. Again, looking at the European Parliament, that's how the European Parliament began. And under Article 12 of the Second Charter, you can see that in most areas, their powers are advisory. In the budget area, which is obviously very important, we provide that the General Assembly creates the budget, And the top 10 contributors to the United Nations, again, in a concession to reality, have to agree themselves to the budget. But ultimately, the Parliament has to approve the budget. Article 15 is one of the most progressive changes that we put into the charter, and it actually provides, for the first time, this is a real paradigm shift, it provides limited legislative powers on behalf of the General Assembly and the Parliament. So the way we've worded it is that if there's, in narrow situations, if there's an exigent circumstance that threatens human species survival in whole or in part, the Parliament and the General Assembly, by an 80% vote, we're trying to keep this very restrictive, can actually create legislation, and that's directly binding on states. But the legislation has to be consistent with the principle of subsidiarity. If it can be done at the national level, then it shouldn't be done by the United Nations bodies. It has to be in accordance with the principle of proportionality, that it has to be narrowly tailored to solving the actual problem that is taking place. It has to have equal and non-discriminatory treatment. It has to be in accordance with human rights law. It cannot interfere with anything under Chapter 7 in peace and security. And finally, and very importantly, it has to be reviewable by the International Court of Justice. So all of these are meant to really circumscribe it, but our belief is that we have to begin to cross this threshold where there's certain things that are so important in the world that we need to be able to have some kind of legislation if it threatens human or species survival. And again, I think this is at the threshold of what is actually politically possible if people can get mobilized to begin to create a system for doing that. So that's our hope. Finally, and also very importantly, and this has come up before, we have a veto override provision where by a 2/3 vote, both the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly can override a veto. And it's come up, and so I'll address it of, well, why not just get rid of the veto completely? And I think, this was controversial among our group as well. But I think the idea is not only to get to be able to have a realistic chance of getting the proposal approved, but also once it's approved, so it's not just a dead letter, there has to be a way of bringing the large countries that have the biggest armies and the largest nuclear arsenals into the discussion. And so in this way, it makes the great powers part of the process. So they have to, if they have their veto, then they have to go to the General Assembly and the Parliamentary Assembly and try and get those bodies to uphold their veto. So even if they lose there, if they've already lost the 2/3 in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, it's likely they might lose in the General Assembly as well. But at least they get engaged in this process. And then it's a lot harder to run away from because the process is legitimate and brings them actually in. So those are the main changes. I think that we're really crossing some big paradigm shifts in a number of ways. And I'd just like to return to the big issue of actually having a parliamentary assembly in the first place. I think this is a huge evolution in the international system. Ultimately, if we're going to get around the problems of sovereignty, where we have nationalism backed up by armies and backed up by diplomacy, it's an absolutely ironclad system for reinforcing essentially a system where militarism is the last resort, to one where there can be shifting and unarmed coalitions as we do within nation states around the world, as Europe has evolved towards. Then we need a system. We need a system, something like what we have. And again, in a concession to reality, it's largely advisory to start with. It's not expecting universal elections to start with. It's a real concession to what we can, at the outward edge of possibility, excite people around the world about and make some serious changes to the global order. Thanks, Augusto.
Thank you, Andrew. You cannot imagine how effectively Andrew has synthesized months and months and months of discussions within the group in, I must admit, a little more than 5 minutes, all right? But we will forgive him for that. Patricia, you are professor of international relations at a Brazilian university, and you have been part of the core group that has put this document together. And the document actually has a number of, I think, very sensible proposals to enhance the efficiency of the Economic and Social Council and to address some of the tensions, not to say contradictions, that the UN Charter has originally between the roles of the General Assembly and the roles of the Council. Tell us a little bit, what are, let's say, the three main recommendations that we have on the Economic and Social Council, and also, how do they fit in within this larger four-council structure that is in the second charter, to which reference was made in the first panel? 5 minutes.
Thank you, Augusto. Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to address this question because so much attention is given to the Security Council when we talk about United Nations reform. But I think one of the main innovations of the original UN Charter is that when we talk about peace, peace is not isolated from economic, social, human rights, fight against discrimination. So in our proposal for the UN Charter reform and in the chapters 9 about international and economic cooperation and chapter 10 about ECOSOC, our effort was to break the silos that still affects the debate of UN reform and try to make more this dialogue between peace, because without economic, social, human rights, we cannot achieve peace. And also peace is important for us to build more resilient and more developed societies. So to address this and to balance this connection between peace and all the UN pillars, our 4 pillars for a council structure is trying to really break the silos and connect those issues, because they're not minor issues. When Augusto first invited me to this project, his question was, should we just eliminate ECOSOC? Because there are so many critics towards this council that it's inefficient, that it's a waste of time. And the consensus in our group was that ECOSOC is fundamental. First, it's important because in ECOSOC we can discuss implementation of the most important General Assembly decisions. Also, ECOSOC can provide us some operational guidelines on how to implement and also connect global to local. And ECOSOC is a revolving door for civil society engagement and other stakeholders engagement. So if we just eliminate ECOSOC in our reform, we would close the most important door of the United Nations to civil society. So for that, we tried to bring a new ECOSOC that could address those problems, but also could bring the best of this council. So we found the 3 inconsistencies in the UN Charter, and we offered 3 recommendations to address them to make ECOSOC a more open and important council to the United Nations. The first inconsistency is that in the UN Charter, there are overlapping functions between the General Assembly and ECOSOC. If you go over through very important paragraphs in chapters 4 and chapters 10, it's pretty much the same job. So we tried to make a real division of labor. As Andrew said, the General Assembly with the PA would be the main chief and deliberative body, creating general guidance, but ECOSOC would focus on reviewing, following up, and providing operational guidelines to the General Assembly and PA resolutions. And also, we tried to address these overlapping functions in a way that everything would come from the GA and PA as universal bodies, and ECOSOC would focus on creating knowledge and creating space for advocacy. So that was our first recommendation for ECOSOC. Our second recommendation was to address the lack of coordination of the UN system. In the UN Charter, that would be a responsibility of ECOSOC, but in the regional charter, ECOSOC has no real power to coordinate these so many UN agencies, subsidiary bodies. And we all know that competition among UN entities is jeopardizing the way we're implementing global agendas, especially the Sustainable Development Goals. So we tried to make ECOSOC a real coordinator, that could provide general guidance and focus on integration of activities. Instead of UN agencies and subsidiary bodies start fighting against each other for mandates, agenda, financial resources, ECOSOC would provide a space for them to dialogue, collaborate, and integrate their activities. So if we have ECOSOC, we could better coordinate, avoid duplication, and make the use of UN resources better instead of duplicating work and losing financial and people resources. And our last recommendation was about ECOSOC representation. Since the 90s, there are many proposals to make ECOSOC smaller, like a Security Council, Economic Social Council with 15 members. There are also proposals for making ECOSOC universal, but that would again duplicate work with the General Assembly. So we decided to keep ECOSOC unchanged in terms of seats for member states, because we think that these demands for making ECOSOC larger or smaller, they come from these overlapping functions with the GA and ECOSOC, and we solved that with our 4 councils for pillars United Nations. So in terms of representation, we tried to expand this role of ECOSOC as a revolving door for civil society, other stakeholders, and give more space for other voices and representation. We all know that Article 71 under ECOSOC is fundamental for civil society and other stakeholders. Many of you are here engaging with the UN today because of Article 71. So our idea was to expand that article and include mentions throughout the charter so we could expand the way civil society and other stakeholders engage with the United Nations, giving facilitating the participation of groups that have been historically excluded from the UN debate, such as groups that are representing women and other gender issues, groups that are representing indigenous peoples that are really isolated from the UN. They only have the permanent forum, bringing voices from youth and different groups that are fighting against discrimination. That was a very important thing for us in this charter. So in the end, our vision for ECOSOC is that this body should be strengthened. It's going to provide operational guidance for the UN work, especially on the ground, because we cannot have a global governance that's not connected to the local work of the United Nations. We want an ECOSOC that would provide better coordination and avoiding competition among UN entities. And we want an ECOSOC that would open this revolving door for civil society and bringing more representation so the United Nations can really be a place of diversity in terms of knowledge, political implementation, and different proposals to solve global problems. I think I'll stay here and we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia, for a very, very succinct, very, very compelling summary. David Passarelli is the director of the UN University's Center for Policy Research, and I have asked him to summarize for ourselves the substance of the proposals contained in a second charter on chapter 15, which deals with the Secretariat, and in particular, the way that we go about electing the Secretary General. Give us your assessment of these proposals. Setting aside the issue of whether the current members of the P5 would actually like these proposals or not, okay? I don't think that should be the focus of this conversation.
Thank you, Augusto, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I am going to start out by saying I am not going to do justice to the incredible work that has gone into this report. And when I saw the questions that you prepared for me on chapter 15, it was broadly on the role of the Secretariat and the proposals that you have in that section. And let me begin by saying that this is, first, I agree, a far-sighted document. Someone said earlier, it is ambitious, but not impossible. And I think the silver lining of this moment, of the Summit of the Future, of the Our Common Agenda process, is that we have a Secretary General that has created space for this conversation. He has invited ambitious proposals. And I speak also from the position of having worked with a group of eminent personalities to develop a high-level advisory board report on effective multilateralism, where they were encouraged repeatedly to come up with the boldest proposals they could and to not think about whether they were implementable, but really to try to advise member states on what could be achieved. And so I welcome and salute the efforts that have gone into this report. And what I think you provide in Chapter 15 is you take forward at least the spirit of what the Secretary General has called for, networked multilateralism. It is a theme that has driven negotiations and conversations over the last 3 years since the launch of our common agenda. And I think this is a valuable contribution to that. Ambassador Navarez said we need a more open and more inclusive UN. And she asked, how do we open the UN to the people? And I think you've offered one potential solution to doing that. And again, I think that should be celebrated. I see your report also as offering flexibility. You were trying to give the Secretary General additional margin for maneuver in a very complicated time, at a moment where he has said we are at risk of global fracture. And I think this idea of a 7-year mandate attempts to do that, whether or not the P5 agree with that. I think the other valuable contribution, you just spoke to this a moment ago, is the idea of breaking vetoes and breaking negotiation by veto blocks as well. And there, I think you have an ally in a parallel initiative where the UN has invested a great deal, and this is the reform of the international financial architecture. When it was envisaged originally, the idea of basic votes in the IMF, for example, were meant to complement quota voting power. And the idea was that you would force negotiations between different blocs. And I think your idea here of invoking a parliamentary assembly goes in that spirit. I do have, of course, some observations reflecting on the process that we've been engaged in. It has been an interesting, enriching conversation over the last 3 years. Your contribution enriches the debate, but we've also learned some lessons, I think, over 3 years. Timing matters. I think if we had to go back to when we started designing this negotiation process, we learned some painful lessons. When we wanted to launch a conversation about the future, retooling global governance institutions, was a time when member states wanted to focus on the SDGs. That's what mattered. We were so far behind, and that timing really mattered, and we had to negotiate that along the way. Sequencing matters as well. And here, I'm going to refer to a tweet that actually my colleague, Ambassador Marta Kimani, just released a few days ago talking about Security Council reform. We would all agree that it is necessary, but also I think the point that he made was that we need coherence within the African Union also. There needs to be initially some coherence within certain groups before you can bring global negotiations forward. And so when we think about this proposal that you are bringing and the very rich agenda, the question that I would put back is, what is the sequence of this conversation? How do we ensure a properly sequenced governance reform effort? And third, unpredictable outcomes. I read the recommendations and the introduction of new actors in global governance, and I think it's hard to predict what the outcomes would be. And I think there's some reticence to accept this change because it is hard to predict. And we have, I think, just recently in August, not so long ago, an example. We have spent many years negotiating a cyber treaty, and there's significant concern that the final treaty that has emerged has real potential consequences for human rights violations. And there's a real live debate right now whether a negotiation that still had the majority of member states endorse this treaty is the best possible outcome. And so unpredictable outcomes is something that we need to entertain and discuss and factor into our thinking. Thank you, Augusto.
Thank you, David. Also, much appreciation for staying within the time limit. All right. Ambassador Narvaez, you are a former president of the Economic and Social Council. And so I want to ask you two things. If you could react a little bit to the substance of the proposals as presented by Patricia. And then a related question, whether there is something more that perhaps we're missing within the UN system, beyond ECOSOC, to address these very fundamental issues of, social economic development and the kinds of issues that you have dealt with in the agenda of ECOSOC.
Thank you so much, Augusto. And I want to thank Patricia for her presentation on ECOSOC. I think I totally agree. First, with this idea that without ECOSOC, the UN is not able to deliver in most of the main importance matters for people. So I think ECOSOC is quite fundamental. Not because I was former president of the main organ of the United Nations. It is because I saw firsthand how this unified platform that the ECOSOC may offer, I want to say may offer, it's fundamental to address development issues as a main action of the United Nations. But having said so, I think that in the current situation, with the ECOSOC as is described and with its mandate today, we can do a lot. I mean, we do not need many reforms because we have had the reviews of the ECOSOC and the HLPF for certain years. We need to implement those recommendations that comes after the review process. And this is a member state's responsibility. Of course, the UN system, the Secretariat, has a role, an important role. Maybe we need to reinforce the capacity of the Secretariat to support the ECOSOC, Bureau work during throughout the year. Maybe that's one concrete aspect that we can reinforce. But still, we have today the segments and the meetings and the conference that we need to address the most important issues that are concerns for everyone. So why we're not doing that? I have tried to figure out the reasons behind this. It's not easy, no? Because I have had an important relationship with my colleagues. So among ambassadors, we have the will to be present. But sometimes when we are there, Martin was there in a very important meeting that we had, trying also to see, I think it was in the last management segment, could be in a specific panel we did regarding the role of ECOSOC. And Martin, from his current capacity, gave us a lot of recommendation on how we can reinforce the work of ECOSOC as well. And during that meeting, that was an important meeting, I have to say, many of member states didn't show up there, didn't say a word there. So that's why I think that we need to connect the role of ECOSOC with the possibility, with the accountability that is needed for member states to be present. And one way to do so is reinforcing the participation of civil society. Because if you have civil society sitting there and you have member states there, you also have the constituency looking at member states and their role in the ECOSOC mandate. So we need to continue reinforcing these ideas with the mandate that we already have in the current description of the ECOSOC, with the coordination segment, with the operational segment, with the management segment. I'm totally sure that Bob Ray, the current permanent representative of Canada and current ECOSOC president, he will be doing his best to continue reinforcing these ideas in order to use the ECOSOC in the way that we should do. I also want to connect the role of ECOSOC with the PDC. You also have there an outstanding opportunity to connect something that is, of course, common sense If we are not addressing development issue, you are of course creating the conditions for having more conflicts. So if you address development issue, you are preventing conflict. It's quite fundamental and very, obvious. So that's why PVC is fundamental, because we can do the connections in this annual meeting between the ECOSOC and the PVC. And of course, the coordination with the Security Council. We are not having the meeting, the annual meeting that we should have between the ECOSOC and the Security Council to address many important issues that are connected, because as you said, these silos are in our, like absolutely, how can I say, not real reality. It's not a reality because they're all connected, no? But last year, the PTA, the former PTA, made an important decision having this joint meeting between Security Council, ECOSOC, and TA to address the Haiti situation. And I think it was an important signal to show how these thoughts are connected. So we need to reinforce those kind of practices as well. And finally, just I mentioned not going beyond the ECOSOC, as you mentioned, Augusto, I think that we have an opportunity with the feminist foreign policy. I have to say that feminist foreign policy that many countries are pursuing, and also my country is one of them, we are not saying that put in the center women's issues. We are saying that from a gender's perspective, we can change the multilateral system, because we are able to offer a new approach on how we can, as you said, connect those issues that are in the field that needed to be addresses from a different wave of power dynamics and power relations. I think the feminist foreign policy is also a way to show that power can be exercised in a different way.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Narvaez. Andrew, the statute of the International Court of Justice is referred to often as an inseparable part of the UN Charter. And I just want to alert you to the fact that in this second charter, we did not include the revisions to the statute. That document exists and it will be on the website within a day or two, all right, for those who are interested. But my question to you, Andrew, is essentially, can you outline for us, what are some of the key sort of reforms proposed under our Chapter 14? And how would they sort of improve the legal capacity and the operations of the court? And why is this important?
Yes, thanks very much, Augusto, for that. The primary change is really a simple change, and that is to provide for compulsory universal jurisdiction for states. Now, some of you that are familiar with the history of the court, the current court, of course, started under the League of Nations as the ironically named Permanent Court of International Justice. And at that time, there was a lot of discussion about whether the court should have compulsory jurisdiction or not. The great powers did not want compulsory jurisdiction, and they went out. The same debate took place at the time of the United Nations, where we got the current International Court of Justice. And again, the idea of compulsory jurisdiction did not win out. So the current system is that states that do not consent one way or another to jurisdiction are not susceptible to being brought before the court by an applicant country. And so we sort of crossed that Rubicon with our draft, as we did in some of these other areas, and we now provide for compulsory jurisdiction. We felt that that was really important to have a dispute resolution system where countries could generally, as long as they're members of the United Nations or signatories before the court, that they could be brought before the International Court of Justice. So that's really the most important change. We also provide in the area of jurisdiction for appellate jurisdiction for other kinds of courts within the international system. Now there, we can't mandate that, for example, the dispute resolution body of the World Trade Organization disputes be brought directly to the International Court of Justice. So it would have to be that whatever the individual regime was, that the regime agreed that appeals could go before the International Court of Justice. But if they do, the court could hear those appeals. Also, review of actions by the United Nations and United Nations bodies. We felt this was absolutely essential, that to have compulsory jurisdiction for all countries, but not for the United Nations itself didn't make any sense. The United Nations, if we're going to have an international rule of law and we're going to have accountability, there has to be some sort of review by United Nations actions. And finally, advisory opinions are allowed now or now we're not quite there, but our proposal is to allow for advisory opinions at the request of the highest courts within any country. So the Supreme Court or Constitutional Court of a country could ask for an advisory opinion on matters of international law, and the court would likely comply with those. They have the power to do that. The other big area where we made some changes was in the law applicable to the court, that the law can apply. We provide that it can now apply, in addition to the traditional sources of international law, that it can now apply resolutions of international organizations, such as the resolutions in Article 15 that I referred to before, the binding law that can be created by the General Assembly and the Security Council. That law applicable to international organizations can be applied. If it's going to review actions by the United Nations and those bodies, it should be able to apply the law that applies to those bodies as well. And domestic law to the extent applicable. The court is not meant to apply domestic law, but law is seamless. And so there may be times where it's necessary to apply domestic law. The other big change is that we do provide for much more possibility for intervention by civil society organizations. We basically put it on par with intervention by other countries or international organizations. It's up to the court in any case to decide the extent of that intervention. So it's very likely the court would not allow for civil society organizations to be the same as nation states, but the court nevertheless has the possibility to provide for significant intervention by interested civil society organizations that could be amicus briefs all the way to appearing or doing more than that. And finally, just following up on Ann Lynn's suggestions and her discussion is we have very much enhanced gender equity throughout the statute of the International Court of Justice. Judges, court personnel, all of that has to be done in a way that's equitable from a gender point of view. So just to sum up, I would say that, we could discuss a lot about compliance theory as a big area in international law. But I would just say very simplistically that in terms of enhancing international law, to answer Augusto's question, nation states can't be expected to follow the law if they don't know what it is. And without compulsory jurisdiction, there's too many areas where there's no clear definition of what the law is. So to the extent that the court is regularly able to define the law, then we have clarity or reasonable clarity on the law. And it's much more likely that we can begin to really create a culture of law compliance when everybody can't argue that the law is whatever they claim it to be. And so I think this is a real evolution in individual cases, as well as much more structurally around creating a system that's much more going to be much more attuned to rule of law concerns. Thank you, Augusto.
Thank you, Andrew. Ambassador Kimani, before posing my question to you, I just need to make a 30-second remark to basically present to you what is the gist of the proposals that we have in the second charter concerning the Security Council. Andrew has already referred to one aspect of that, which is the the issue of the override, the veto override. So I won't focus on that. But essentially, these were some of the more complicated, complex conversations that we had over the last year and a half. And eventually what we came up with to address the question of representation in the Security Council and the veto is essentially the following. We expand the membership of the Security Council from 15 members to 25 members, right? The five permanent members continue to be permanent members, subject to the veto override. Then we create a category of 5 more members, which are given a renewable 6-year term. And these 5 members come from the 5 regions that are typically used in UN definitions, Africa, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Western Europe. And then we have, that's 5 plus 5, that's 10. Then we have an additional 15 members, which get non-renewable 3-year terms. And these 15 members are allocated, again, across the 5 regions of the planet, but in proportion to the number of countries that each of the regions has within the total UN membership. To summarize, Africa gets 5, Asia Pacific gets 4, Eastern Europe gets 4, Latin America gets 2, and Western Europe gets only 1 because they already have France and the UK among the P5. All right, so that's essentially what we eventually came up with. Right, I emphasize for the third time, we did not do away with the veto formally, but we do have the override, which is the sort of built-in protection. So, your reactions to the substance of these proposals, Ambassador Kimani, very briefly. Again, I'm not asking you whether the P5 would like it or not like it. I'm asking you to focus on the substance.
Yeah, I won't comment on the P5, but their attitudes are substantial. One, I really appreciate the work that went into this report, and I find the proposals for Security Council reform to broadly go in the direction of making it a more effective institution. So, for instance, the expansion of the membership and the 5 regional representations would give Chapter 8 on regional organizations more life and more strength. It would mean that those long-term chairs would be much more empowered to feed into regional peace and security arrangements, which would in turn help the Security Council to implement its mandate more effectively. I think it's a terrific insight and proposal. On the more temporary seats, 5 more temporary seats, they can't do any harm, I don't think, but I think there should be a bit more added on what is the responsibility test for these countries. So I have seen regions suggesting non-permanent members, and knowing the rigors and pressures of the council and wanting to be as generous-minded as I can be, the delegations, I think, that struggle very much in the Security Council to carry out their responsibilities as non-permanent members. So we want to do something in the GA that allows those countries to come in and show what they're ready to do. We also, the paper does not look deeply at financing arrangements. It understands there'll be financial implications on the changes it proposes. But perhaps one of them can be a bit of assessed funding support for some non-permanent members. And this would allow countries that are developing, that are determined and principled, but may not be financially strong, to really be able to participate fully in the council. And that is a more modest goal than maybe imagined. On the veto power override, this is the gold standard, of course. And I've dreamt of the GA rejecting a veto. It's difficult. I take that it needs to be tabled. It needs to be tabled. On the parliamentary arrangement, I haven't thought hard enough on it. I think it's great for democratic participation and engagement of the world's people. but it adds another step. But you said not to consider too much the difficulties, but it is appreciated, the expansion of the democratic nature of the organization. But I would look at the veto override first at on the GA. You also talk about the Secretary General and Article 100. A key part of the Security Council's change has to be you linking how a strengthened Article 100 compliance by states will actually feed into the work of the Security Council. We saw Secretary General Guterres prompting the council, calling for an emergency. And it was the right thing to do to call it for what is going on now in the Middle East. But the question was, why hadn't it been used before in some serious difficulties? And we also, I recall an incident where the Secretary General, it was widely reported, was being bugged by a major P5 member. And so Article 100 and the independence of the Secretary General does need to be reinforced. Finally, and not to range Augusto into the issue of the P5 too much, I can never unforget that each of the veto-wielding members also have nuclear weapons. And I've always wondered at the linkage between disarmament and the veto, and wondered what would the world look like if the P5 didn't have nuclear weapons and the sole power they had internationally was that veto and their wealth. What would that look like? I'd be very interested in what Andrew and the people who have thought this up, grappling with this relationship between nuclear deterrence and the veto in terms of assuring top status in international relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kimani. Thank you very much. I'm looking at my watch, and therefore I will plead with David and with Patricia, the last two questions, to limit their remarks to 3 minutes, if possible, so that we can then have another 15 minutes or so for Q&A. David, we spent a great deal of time on Chapter 1 on the purposes and principles of the UN. And not because we worked on it, I think that we significantly beefed up, that particular chapter, especially on issues like environment, the social sphere, human rights, and so on. Should we have done more? Is there something that we missed that you would like to bring to our attention?
I will be quick. First, I'm going to celebrate two things, and then I'm going to point out two things that perhaps could have been mentioned. The focus on the environment is clear, and it's welcome. It's necessary, it's a necessity to include it, but I think it's also the responsible thing to do, given what we know of the science today. We're here talking about global governance reform, and I think the linkage between a stable environment to stable governments, to stable representatives of those governments in the forum that you are thinking of reforming, there's a very close link between those things. You can't have stable government without a stable environment. And so I think it justifies the elevation of the environment, and it's something we called for as well in the High-Level Advisory Board. I see also in the preamble many of the principles of effective multilateralism that we champion in the High-Level Advisory Board report. I note that you've created in one of the paragraphs space for civil society, people, civil society, and other interested groups. And I would simply draw attention to one principle of effective multilateralism, flexibility, that we included in our report, simply to suggest perhaps language along the lines of the report. And our language was that we wanted to encourage effective multilateralism. For us, was encouraging subgroupings of states to explore, innovate, and implement new approaches to global problems. And so this idea of plurilateral coalitions and encouraging plurilateral coalitions. But ultimately, the principles I think you've captured in the new preamble. What is missing? Ambassador Kimani just mentioned the link between nuclear weapons and the veto. And you include in this preamble specifically a commitment for comprehensive disarmament. We also called for comprehensive disarmament in our report. But I do wonder if very quickly our capacity for harm using new technologies is going to become on par with nuclear weapons and is going to be in the hands of many other actors, non-state actors. And there's nothing in the preamble that focuses on that, on these new harms and the potential for harm through new technologies. And I wonder if we're drawing too much attention. You're thinking far into the future. I wonder if we're drawing too much attention actually to this issue of nuclear disarmament solely at the expense of other potential risks. And just finally, I think a really great paper from IPI a little while ago was talking about the constraints that small states have at the UN. And one of those constraints in these negotiations is asymmetric information. And how do we capacitate small states to negotiate in this forum? Building those capacities. I think something could be said in the preamble, but an organization that invests in a level playing field if we are setting new rules for global governance. Thank you, Augusto.
Thank you very much, David. In his remarks earlier in the first panel, Josh Lincoln alluded that in the next phase of our work program, we're going to be developing some protocols which are mentioned in the second charter, but which have yet to be developed, one on disarmament. And I guess the case that you're making, that the focus of such protocols should perhaps be somewhat wider, I think is a very, very good idea. And thank you very much for that. Patricia, when we published this document, we were quite certain that the title should be a second United Nations Charter, but then we debated for some time, what should the subtitle be, right? And eventually, I don't remember who brought this idea to the table. It doesn't really matter the way we work. This idea of the intergenerational responsibilities that we have, to the new generation, came up very prominently. Why are we doing this? We're doing it so that our children or our grandchildren can live in a more peaceful, more stable world. And so I wanted to ask you if you could just comment a little bit on that. And then also, you were one of the more enterprising members of our group. Tell us a little bit about, in 30 seconds, your personal experience of having worked on this project. Incidentally, she has brought some of her students here, so I think this is a very appropriate question for Patricia because she deals with the next generation as well.
Thank you, Augusto. Well, I think this project for me was very important because the approach to the UN reform was to go at the core of this organization, which is the UN Charter. So many debates on UN reform works with rules of procedure, working methods, but if we don't change the core principles of this organization, it doesn't matter if we change the way we work, if we don't change our core values, principles, and pillars of this organization. So that was very engaging to me, to working, redrafting this new charter, because it's about action, this project. When we rewrite the charter, we are acting because we're creating new language that may not be accepted today or in a couple of years, but this new language will come up with new conversations. And we want that different generations can engage in this conversation. So for us, this conversation is based on diversity. For me, that was always a special issue in this project because common goals, common values, is really what the UN Charter is about, but we wanted to bring common goals and common values based on diversity. Diversity makes everything stronger. Let's take the example of nature. When we have, diverse ecosystems, these ecosystems are stronger. So for us, to modernize the UN means let's dialogue with different knowledge systems. Let's bring other voices to this point. And I know that our colleagues, they know this quote because I quoted this in many of our meetings, and I'd like to finish with this quote from a Brazilian philosopher and indigenous leader, Ailton Krenak. He has a very interesting book that is called Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. And he says about this, the fact that we can share this space, that we're traveling together, does not mean we are the same. Whether that we are capable of attracting one another precisely because of our differences. And I think this group represents that. And that it's those differences that ought to plot our odyssey. It's real diversity we need, not an ersatz or artificial humanity. So I think for the second charter, our way to modernize the UN for a new generation is that we refuse this artificial UN. We really want real diversity for this organization. We want to make UN ecosystem stronger. And for that, we need more voices, different knowledge systems, and real debate with different groups and with different perspectives. So that's what I hope for our new generation. Thank you, Augusto.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. We are going to open up the floor, and any questions, please, this is the time to do it. And I'm speaking both to those present in this room and to people who are connected online. Rebecca, and then the gentleman here, please.
Thank you so much for this incredibly insightful session. I'm going to speak in my capacity as the co-convener of the Impact Coalition on Just Institutions in the International Court of Justice, so primarily to Andrew's remarks, as well as the co-founder of the Legal Alternatives to War Law Not War campaign, which we're delighted is supported graciously by the Global Challenges Foundation. So last year, a little bit less than a year ago, actually, in this very room, we launched the Legal Alternatives to War campaign. And we're joined on that occasion by the then permanent representatives of Mexico and Romania, who just a few short weeks later became judges of the court. And that campaign is born out of the recognition that while we await the second UN Charter and compulsory jurisdiction over all states, states can show their good faith and commitment to the principles of the UN Charter and the aspirations of the International Court of Justice by making a declaration, depositing a declaration of compulsory jurisdiction that 74 states have done. We urge humbly Kenya and Chile to join that number, hopefully soon. Putting on another hat for a moment as the co-convener of the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court, I would hope that we would see a bit more of the language on the ICC bolstered in the second UN Charter. It is, after all, what Kofi Annan called the hope for all humanity. But the universality and support and cooperation for that entity has not yet been reflected in the second United Nations Charter. So humbly submit those, and if anybody has suggestions, and if anybody is interested in these topics, we have a side event tomorrow morning on these issues.
Thank you, Rebecca. The gentleman here. Daniel, does that mean that the people on the screen are waiting to come in? Not necessarily. Because usually there's a little hand signal, right?
You can see Aza's hand is up, and she's the only one on the screen.
All right. The gentleman, and then we'll go to Aza Karam. If we could have questions.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
So my name is Mandeep Tabana. I'm speaking on behalf of Civicus. So 3 questions to the panel. Thank you very much for your excellent comments. So the first is, how do we create a UN that's by and of the people? So you've spoken about inclusivity, and we had one of the things that of course came up is, you know, parliamentary assembly. So we have a UN that's for the people now, but how do we create it more often by the people? So any specific examples that you could have of institutions we can create, what mechanisms can we enable to have more civil society participation? So specificity would be really helpful, because the proof of the pudding really lies in the eating. The second question I want to raise is, so we know by hindsight that of the 3 pillars of the UN, the human rights pillar is sort of the orphan pillar, and that's our experience shows. And that's one of the conversations that's happening in the Pact for the Future negotiations at the moment. So the Pact, you know, talks about strengthening the human rights pillar. So how would you see the human rights pillar being strengthened? And what are the specific things we need to ensure that the human rights pillar is, you know, is brought up on par with the other 2 pillars, since they're supposed to be mutually reinforced and so on. And the third question I have for you is that, you know, it's all very good to expand the Security Council and so on. How do we prevent rotation of elites? We know that the countries that are vying for permanent seats on the Security Council don't really want to do it for democratic reasons. They basically want to emulate the same behavior of the P5. So how do we ensure that, you know, that does not happen?
Dr. Karam, please come in.
So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the presentations. And as those of you who know me, I would also like to give a special thanks to the Baha'i international community for actually co-stewarding and hosting this session. two of my questions have already been raised by the previous speaker. Thank you very much. I do have two questions related, perhaps just as an opportunity to elaborate. Given this new format, the structure that is being proposed, how would it change the dynamics of the UN and the member states vis-a-vis what we are confronting today already? What difference, for instance, would this new vision and envisioned restructuring, what difference would it make to the existing war in Gaza and on Palestinians? What difference would it make? Just as an example to help elaborate. And my second and last point has to do with this image of an inclusive sector of multilateralism in the UN that would take into account civil society. I love that vision. I'm completely committed to it. However, I think we may be at the risk of essentializing civil society quite significantly. It isn't one homogeneous entity called civil society. In fact, civil societies make the member states look like a walk in the park. So how do you see that exactly, that, oh, if we're opening up to civil society, who, which, where, and how? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those very good questions. I will make a pause here and come to the panel, and perhaps I will give Andrew the word first.
Thanks, Augusto. Yes, thanks for those great questions. And I'll just address the structural question of how the changes that we're proposing would actually change global politics. And sort of, I think that ties well into the role of civil society. So I kind of alluded to this a bit in my comments before, but very cryptically, so perhaps I can expand a little bit. By having a parliament as a central organization, that begins to move the organization in the direction of civility, the way in which it works ideally in democratic countries around the world. Democracy, having people participate, has a lot of different attributes, but one of them is that it's pacific settlement of disputes, that there's a process for people, not just governments, not just people that have captured the mantle of the state, but for citizens at the grassroots levels to actually participate. And we have provisions throughout the document that allow for civil society, and this sort of answers this question, to be recognized by ECOSOC is the current system. But once they're recognized, that there has to be protocols in all of the different organs for allowing for broader civil society participation, and particularly around the parliament. So that eventually what you could imagine happening is that with a parliament, citizens are involved in electing eventually their representatives to the parliament. Citizens become more involved in actually lobbying the parliament, and you begin to have a whole sphere of democratic governance that's taking place, where citizens aren't captive solely by their own countries, but there begins to be a civil space globally for citizens from all sorts of different groups to come together. And the point that civil society is not uniform, that civil society is inchoate, that civil society doesn't always agree, is exactly the point here, is that different representatives of civil society come together. They argue with each other. They try and come up with common proposals and work with the delegates to the assembly to try and get a legitimate body to support those proposals. That's the way politics works around the world. And note, very importantly, that's not backed by armies. That's backed by civility and legitimacy, that what's approved is something that is going to be accepted because people have all been involved in the process. And the hope is that this will change the basic structure of global governance over time.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. David?
If I may, very quickly, just because I have to step out at 12:30. Thank you for the question. You were looking at me while you were speaking. I'm not sure if that was a question to me about a UN buy-in for the people, and you wanted some specific examples. Let me give you just one. Over the last year, the Secretary General has worked very closely with UN Habitat on a new high-level advisory body to rethink how local governments and regional governments engage with the United Nations. And they will be coming out with new modalities and mechanisms to strengthen that engagement. And I think coming out of the pandemic and looking at many different issues on the global agenda, there is no issue that does not land with a regional or local government. And having those voices in the multilateral system, a willingness to strengthen those voices, giving them more space, I think is one concrete way that we are shifting in the direction that I think you're advocating for. Thank you so much. And my apologies for exiting the room.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you for coming. Thank you. I know this is a very busy period for you. Thank you for your contributions. Any other of the other panelists would like to? Ambassador Narvaez, please.
I'm just speaking regarding the current system and not this proposal, I want to say. And I want to highlight the importance of major groups and other stakeholders as a counterpart during the ECOSOC work. I mean, during my presidency of ECOSOC, it was quite fundamental to have the regular meetings with major groups and other stakeholders every single month throughout the year. And it's not just a meeting to catch up, it's a meeting also to strategize some decisions. And I think we need to institutionalize, I'm so sorry, that word is so difficult, even in Spanish, but to have that moment to think with them, the different conference meetings and how the role of the civil society will look like during this conference in order to avoid false expectations, talk with reality, talk frankly with them, and of course also hear what more we can do regarding the engagement and the capacity of civil society to be heard and to influence and to do the advocacy. I just want to say very simple changes that are so important for civil society. You can have them addressing from the floor, in the room, within in between the interventions of member states. It's quite a very simple thing, but it's quite a difference because you have the full room and you have member states hearing what civil society is saying. I mean, we need to make this compromise with them, this commitment with them, and honor these commitments with them. I'm so sorry if I'm saying something very simple, very basic, but I think we can do those kind of things. Also, another example is how we connect or we help as member states to connect civil society among themselves, because they're also working on silos sometimes. And it's important, for instance, major groups and all stakeholders from UNEP or UNEA, connections with with civil society, major groups and other stakeholders from HLPF, for instance, and how to do those connections. So let's help them also to have these conversations in a horizontal way. We can do this kind of enabling or enablers mechanisms that I think can work or may work in a very positive way. And we are totally aware about civil society, diversity, and the composition. And we cannot treat them in the same way. They are different, of course, and we have now a mechanism that we need maybe also to apply for different UN organs today that are not, so open to have civil society inside the room.
Thank you, Ambassador Narvaez, for those concluding remarks. I would like to thank you once again for participating, to all the panelists for making the time available within their busy schedules. I know that Daniel has already indicated to the people who are connected online that the second charter is available on the homepage of the Global Governance Forum. I want to say that to you here as well. Please distribute it widely. This is This is the first day of a dialogue, which we hope will take at least a year. And then if things go as planned, next year, then we will come back to you with substantial additional comment on the protocols which underpin this work. let's see where this takes us. Ambassador.
I'm so sorry, but I think it's so important not to leave some, to left some topics that are quite fundamental. Human rights were addressed here. And I think we need to also connect Geneva and New York. It's one of the aspects that we can do more between or among member states. Now, that connection, that coordination not always exists, and we need to do more. And the Universal Periodic Review as an instrument, I think that we also need to reinforce. We also to broadcast more what happened there, but I think it's a good instrument that we need to use more in order to address the human rights situation, as you said.
Manny, yes.
Just one word, because she opened the floor. That's it.
I'm sorry.
No, Paula, you're always on point. I just wanted to say that the money that this system uses comes from people. It doesn't come from governments and diplomats. It comes from citizens. So one, there should be foundations, civil society, business should consider creating a people's fund to feed multilateralism that has very clear conditionalities on inclusion of the civil society voice in a way that is balanced globally, not just those with the most money. Secondly, action on the ground in terms of action on budgets for those who give voluntary funding. Citizens can put considerable pressure on legislators and how executives budget for money that's coming to the UN. So just do it and you will see how quickly you will be included here in New York because it's all about the money. Thank you.
On that very sobering statement, we bring this discussion to an end. Thank you so much, and thank you for the panelists.
Thank you.